Dee's wrists ached from the cold bite of the metal restraints locked tight against his skin. The floor beneath him was harder than he expected, smooth, metallic, humming faintly with the pulse of an unseen power source. The air smelled sterile, carrying the faint tinge of something synthetic, something alien. It wasn't exactly the five-star prison suite he would have hoped for if he ever got himself captured by extraterrestrials. But hey, at least the hospitality was consistent across the galaxy. "All right," he muttered to himself, flexing his fingers to keep the blood flowing. "Let's assess the situation. 1, I'm alive. 2, I'm restrained. 3, I'm alone in a cold cell aboard an alien warship where I assume the in-flight entertainment consists of getting tortured for information." He exhaled sharply, his breath forming a ghostly mist in the dim artificial light. A low hum reverberated through the walls like the ship itself was breathing, an unsettling reminder that he was very much out of his depth. Then the door slid open with a quiet hiss. Dane tensed, expecting some towering alien brute with a cruel-looking weapon, maybe something that vaporized limbs one at a time. Instead, he was greeted by her. She stepped inside hesitantly, her body poised somewhere between authority and reluctance. Her skin shimmered under the cold lights, an iridescent silver blue that rippled subtly as she moved. Her hair, if it could be called that, fell in sleek tendrils down her back, shifting like liquid strands, and her eyes, large, deep violet, full of something unreadable, locked onto his. Dan swallowed, expecting a look of cold command, a glare filled with the weight of a captor observing a lesser species. Instead, her expression was something else entirely, fear. Not the kind of fear a predator has for an armed opponent, no. This was something deeper, more primal, a rabbit cornered by an unseen fox, a diver watching shadows move beneath them in deep water, and she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze flickered past him to the closed door behind him, as if she expected something to come crashing through at any moment. Dee tilted his head, shifting his bound wrist slightly. "Okay," he said, breaking the silence. "I'll bite. Why do you look more scared than I do? Because I was pretty sure I was the only one who should be wetting themselves in this situation." She flinched at his voice, as if realizing only now that she wasn't alone. Her lips parted and she spoke, words tumbling out in a smooth but unfamiliar rhythm, her voice sharp but wavering. The translator earpiece embedded just behind Dan's ear crackled to life, struggling to process her alien tongue. For a few seconds, all it could muster was garbled nonsense. "Then it is here." Dan blinked, care to be a little less ominous. She didn't answer. Instead, she took a slow, careful step backward, her violet eyes locked onto the door. Dan followed her gaze, his body suddenly aware of the silence pressing down around them. The ship had been humming just moments ago, a constant, quiet vibration beneath his skin, but now stillness. Even the soft thrum of power in the walls had faded. Dan exhaled through his nose. "All right, see, I don't love that. Generally, when the scary alien lady gets nervous, I assume that means I should also be nervous." She didn't react to his words. Instead, she turned her gaze back to him, studied him as if weighing something in her mind. Then, without a word, she reached forward and tapped a panel on the wall. Dan flinched as his restraint snapped open with a quiet hiss. He flexed his hands, rubbing his sore wrists as he glanced at her in confusion. "That's it?" he asked. "No dramatic negotiation, no forced labor exchange, just boop and I'm free." She grabbed his arm, not painfully but firm enough that he got the message. She wasn't freeing him out of mercy. She was freeing him because whatever she feared was worse than letting a human prisoner go. D&E let out a long sigh, rubbing a hand down his face. "Fantastic. I love it when I'm the lesser problem in a crisis." The ship trembled. A deep, distant groan reverberated through the walls. LX. He didn't know why he suddenly felt like that was her name, but it fit, whispered something under her breath, something the translator failed to process. D&E took a step forward, rubbing his sore wrists. "So, what's the game plan here? We run, we hide, we negotiate with a..." She shot him a sharp look. "Cannot negotiate." Dan winced. Cool, just checking." The floor beneath them vibrated, a faint rhythmic pulse like something was walking. No, not walking. Moving, spreading. Dan exhaled. "Okay, before we get eaten, I'd just like to say this is officially in the top 5 worst dates I've ever been on." LX didn't react. Either she didn't understand his humor or whatever was coming made jokes irrelevant. The door in front of them shuttered, Dan's spine locked. The lights flickered. LX took a step back, DNE took a step forward. Well, that's never a good sign. A low, wet clicking sound echoed from the other side of the door. The lights flickered again, and then the door started to open. The chains were on me, so why was the alien woman afraid? The door slid open with the reluctant hiss of a system that didn't quite want to function. The light in the corridor beyond flickered weakly, casting elongated shadows that danced unnervingly across the walls. Dan didn't consider himself a coward, but he was also a big fan of survival, and right now, every part of his brain was screaming that staying put was a fantastic idea. LX, however, had other plans. The moment the gap in the door was wide enough, she grabbed Dan's wrist and yanked him forward with surprising strength. He stumbled, barely managing to keep up as she rushed into the dimly lit hallway. Okay, I get it, he hissed. Urgency, imminent death, but maybe let's establish a safe word before you tear my arm off. LX ignored him, her glowing violet eyes scanning the corridor with an intensity that made his own nerves tighten. DNE swallowed hard and risked a glance behind them. He regretted it immediately. The shadows near the door moved, not in a normal "oh, look," a flickering light kind of way. No, stretched, elongated, coiling against the walls like something sentient, like something that had just realized its prey was trying to escape. Not to alarm you, Dan whispered, but I think the concept of darkness itself is trying to eat us. LX gave him a sharp look. Move faster. D did not argue. They bolted down the corridor, their footfalls echoing against the smooth metal floor. The warship felt strangely empty. No guards, no automated defenses, nothing that suggested he was on an alien vessel meant for war. Quick question, Dan huffed between strides. Where is everybody? LX didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled him into an alcove and tapped a panel on the wall, bringing up a faintly glowing holographic display. Dan glanced at it. He had no idea what he was looking at. A series of shifting alien symbols, pulsating red and orange, marked various points on the map. LX frowned, her silver-blue skin rippling slightly as she muttered something in her native tongue. The translator earpiece struggled before spitting out. Spread too fast, we are alone. Dan inhaled sharply. Awesome, love that for us. Just to clarify, by spread, do you mean the creepy shadow stuff that is apparently breaking the laws of physics? LX hesitated, then nodded. Dan exhaled. Cool, just checking. The ship trembled again, the walls groaning as if in protest. The lights dimmed further, casting the entire corridor in an eerie half-darkness. Something shifted at the far end of the hall. It was subtle at first, just a ripple, a disturbance in the air. Then, slowly, the darkness pulled together, forming something that almost resembled a shape, not quite solid, not quite fluid, something in between. Dan's heart pounded. I really hate that. LX grabbed his wrist again. Run. Dan did not need to be told twice. They sprinted down another corridor, the ship groaning under some unseen strain. The shadows slithered along the walls, moving faster now, almost as if they were learning. Not to be critical of your escape strategy, Dan panted. But do we actually have a destination in mind, or are we just running for the sake of cardio? LVX shot him a glare. Engineering deck, lockdown, controls. Right, DNE nodded. That makes sense, but also have we considered he gestured vaguely behind them, panicking and giving up. The ship jolted violently, throwing them both against the nearest wall. DNE grunted as his shoulder slammed into the cold metal, but at least it was preferable to whatever was pursuing them. LX cursed under her breath. Dan groaned. If that was the hyperdrive failing, I'm going to be really upset. LBX didn't respond, which was probably not a good sign. Instead, she forced open another door, revealing a small maintenance shaft. D peered inside. It was a tight, enclosed space with dim emergency lighting flickering every few seconds. Yeah, no, he shook his head. I've seen too many horror movies to voluntarily crawl into that. LX grabbed the front of his shirt and shoved him inside. Dan flailed. Okay, that's fair. She climbed in after him, sealing the door behind them. The moment it shut, the corridor outside fell into complete darkness. For a few seconds, there was only silence, then a slow, deliberate scraping sound. Dan clenched his jaw. Oh, fantastic. It can smell fear, can it? LX didn't answer, but the way her body tensed told him all he needed to know. Something slid against the door, then silence again. Dan exhaled carefully. So what exactly are we dealing with? Just for reference, should I be picturing creepy, unknowable horror from beyond the stars, or more like a really aggressive space ghost? LX hesitated, then murmured, "Not ghost, not alive, not dead, it learns." Dan ran a hand down his face. "Oh great, it's an adaptive nightmare." LVX pressed a sequence of buttons on her wrist display, bringing up another faint holographic projection. She studied it for a moment, then pointed forward. "This way, faster." Dan sighed. "You say that like I enjoy running for my life." Still, he followed her deeper into the maintenance shaft, the walls closing in around them. The air was thick, laced with the faint scent of heated metal and something more organic underneath, like the ship itself was sweating. For a war vessel, it sure as hell wasn't making him feel particularly safe. They crawled for what felt like an eternity before emerging into another open space, this one much larger, filled with rows of glowing control panels. Dan stumbled to his feet and stretched. Okay, that was officially the worst game of the floor is lava I've ever played. LVX ignored him, moving swiftly to a terminal. She began typing in a rapid sequence of commands, her expression unreadable. Dan rubbed his temples. So do we have a plan, or are we just pressing random buttons and hopping for the best? LX gave him a sharp glance. Containment. If fails, ship must be destroyed. Dane froze. I was really hoping you'd say something less explody. The ship trembled again, more violently this time. From the corridor behind them, the scraping sound returned. LERX muttered something in her own language, likely a curse, then she turned back to the console. Dan exhaled. You know what? I take back all my earlier complaints. Let's absolutely push the big red blow up the ship button. LX typed faster. The shadows slithered closer, and the nightmare hunting them learned a little more. The chains were on me, so why was the alien woman afraid? Den had officially reached his limit. There was only so much an Earthborn human could take before his brain shut down and decided, nope, not my problem anymore. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of an alien engineering deck, watching an actual nightmare creep its way closer while LX frantically punched commands into a control panel that was either going to save them or, given his luck, activate the self-destruct sequence 5 minutes too late. So just to clarify, Dan muttered, packing slightly as he kept an eye on the corridor, we're dealing with an unstoppable shadow monster that learns from its prey and apparently has an appetite for entire starships. And our best idea is to what? Lock the doors and hope it respects privacy. LX didn't even glance up as her fingers danced over the glowing interface. Containment field, plasma reinforcement, quantum destabilization barrier. Dan arched a brow. Oh great, all words I do not understand, but let's pretend I do. The ship shuddered violently, almost as if it had overheard him and was deeply offended. The overhead lights flickered again, each pulse of darkness lasting a little longer than the last. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate scraping against metal. Dane tensed. You know, I've seen a lot of horror movies, and usually this is the part where the idiot says, "What was that?" and immediately gets eaten, so instead I'm just going to preemptively say, "I told you so." LX exhaled sharply, still focused on her work. Human talks too much. Dan crossed his arms. Yeah, well, talking is my defense mechanism. Right now, I am using elite-level survival sarcasm to cope with our impending doom. The scraping sound grew louder. Dan risked a glance toward the hallway. The shadows there were shifting, pulsing, moving in ways that should not have been possible. He could swear he saw the outline of something, a jagged form, something with too many angles and not enough edges. It was like his brain refused to fully process what it was seeing, as if reality itself rejected the thing that lurked beyond the dim light. All right, DNE muttered, running a hand through his hair. How long until that fancy containment field kicks in? LX hesitated before answering, which was not reassuring. Minutes. Dan groaned. Fantastic, minutes, not like this is a life-or-death situation or anything. LVEC shot him a look, her expression unreadable. Human fight. Dan blinked. Define fight. Because if you mean engage in hand-to-hand combat with a physics-defying horror from beyond the stars, then my answer is a very firm no. LX muttered something under her breath, probably a curse if Dan had to guess, before yanking open a storage compartment and tossing something toward him. He caught it instinctively. It was a weapon. Sleek, alien, and humming with an energy that made the air around it vibrate. The design was unfamiliar, but the intent was clear. Dan frowned. I was really hoping this was a bag of emergency snacks, but nope, definitely a space gun. LIREX ignored his commentary and activated a different panel on the wall. A new series of glowing symbols appeared, pulsing in sync with the ship's heartbeat-like hum. Day exhaled. All right, I'll bite. What does this button do? Dispersal beacon. Right, and that means... LX gave him a look, lures it away. DNE stared at her, then at the panel, then back at her. Hold on, hold on. You're telling me that this thing, this monster that has been actively trying to murder us in the most dramatic way possible, is about to be led away like a cat chasing a laser pointer. LX frowned slightly. Yes. Dan ran a hand down his face. Okay, I take back everything bad I ever said about science fiction logic. I love it. Let's do it. LX pressed the command. Instantly, a low-frequency pulse rippled through the room. It wasn't loud, not exactly. It was more like a vibration at the edge of perception, a pressure against the skull that made Dan instinctively flinch. The effect on the shadows was immediate. The movement in the corridor stilled. The shifting darkness hesitated, then began to pull away, as if something unseen had just called it elsewhere. Dan exhaled. Oh wow, that actually worked. LX didn't answer, she was already moving. We go now. Dai scrambled after her as they sprinted through the now empty corridor. He could still feel the wrongness in the air, but at least for now, the immediate danger seemed to be backing off. Okay, he panted as they ran. Quick question. What happens if it figures out that we just played it for a fool? LX didn't hesitate. Then we die. Dan let out a long sigh. Cool, love the optimism. They reached another bulkhead, and LX wasted no time activating the manual override. The door slid open, revealing a smaller chamber filled with consoles, blinking lights, and, most importantly, an exit hatch leading to what looked like an emergency escape system. Dan took a deep breath. So Plan A was containment, Plan B was running. Do we have a Plan C, or are we just improvising from here? LX turned toward him, her violet eyes glinting in the dim light. Plan C is survival. Dan rolled his shoulders. All right, fine, but just so we're clear, I am absolutely adding this to my list of top 10 worst first impressions. LX arched a brow. This not first impression. Dan frowned. I feel like I would remember meeting you before, considering this entire nightmare scenario is kind of memorable. LX hesitated, then quietly she said, You do not remember, but you should. DNE blinked. I am way too tired to deal with cryptic alien revelations right now, he muttered. The ship groaned again, the walls trembling. The dispersal beacon had bought them time, but not much, and whatever was hunting them wasn't gone. Not yet. The chains were on me, so why was the alien woman afraid? The emergency hatch slid open with a reluctant hiss, revealing a dimly lit tunnel leading to what DNE could only assume was the escape pod bay. The air was thick with tension, humming with unseen energy as if the ship itself was holding its breath. DNE ran a hand through his hair, still gripping the alien firearm LVX had thrown at him earlier. So, he panted, glancing at her, are we at the part of the plan where we definitely make it out alive, or are we still in the wildly improvised chaos phase? LX didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed a series of commands into her wrist panel, her silver-blue skin reflecting the dim emergency lighting. Then, without looking at him, she said, "There was never a plan." Dan let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, no kidding. I figured that out somewhere between running for our lives and playing intergalactic laser tag with an unkillable nightmare." She turned to him then, her violet eyes flickering with something unreadable. "You joke, but you are afraid." Dane exhaled, leaning against the wall. "Oh, absolutely terrified. But fear is a lot easier to handle when you mix it with a little sarcasm. Otherwise, I'd just be some guy screaming constantly, which I assume would get really annoying." LX tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then she said, "You do not remember me." DNE frowned. "Oh, okay, you mentioned that earlier, and I'd really love to unpack it, but maybe let's focus on not dying first." She didn't argue. Instead, she turned toward the tunnel ahead. "Pods are close. If system functions, we leave. If not." Dan finished the sentence for her. "We die horribly in deep space. Got it. Great. Let's roll the dice." They moved quickly, navigating the dimly lit corridor, their footsteps barely making a sound against the metal floor. Dane could feel the wrongness in the ship, the lingering presence of whatever thing had been hunting them. The dispersal beacon had lured it away, but for how long? Elsie stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. DNE froze, his heart hammering. "What?" he whispered. She pressed a finger to her lips, motioning toward the air vent above them. Something was moving inside. Dan inhaled slowly, gripping the weapon. "I swear, if that thing is about to drop down on us from the ceiling like some nightmare version of an air duct gremlin." The vent groaned. Dan closed his eyes. "Yep, called it." LX moved fast, pulling him backward just as something slithered out of the vent. Something dark, shifting, wrong. It wasn't solid, it wasn't liquid, it wasn't anything that should exist in the physical world. Dan fired instinctively. A bolt of searing plasma shot from his weapon, striking the thing midair. It screeched, a sound that didn't belong in this dimension, like something being torn through a dozen different realities at once. LX grabbed Dan's wrist. "Run." "No arguments here," he yelped, already moving. The escape pod bay was just ahead, the doors barely clinging to power. LX pressed a command into her wrist panel, forcing them open with a final surge of energy. Inside, a single pod remained, its sleek silver surface flickering with dim lights, the interface waiting for an activation command. Dane nearly collapsed against it. "Oh, thank you, functional technology." LX hesitated. Dane caught the expression on her face and frowned. "Oh, no, 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 I know that look. That is not a good look. What are you about to tell me?" She turned to him. "Pod is for one." Dan's stomach dropped. "You've got to be kidding me." LX didn't respond. Instead, she took a slow step back, pressing a sequence of commands on the panel. The escape pod system lit up, preparing for launch. Dan's brain caught up to what she was doing. "No, nope, absolutely not. I'm not taking the pod while you stay behind to do some dramatic last stand nonsense." She looked at him then, a small flicker of something behind her expression. "Someone must finish containment." Dan clenched his jaw. "Then we both stay or we both go." She didn't argue, but she didn't move toward the pod either. The ship groaned again, the walls pulsing like a dying heartbeat. Whatever had been hunting them was getting closer. The dispersal beacon effect was wearing off. Dan exhaled sharply. "All right, let's do this the human way." Before LX could react, he grabbed her. "Human," she started, but DNE had already spun her toward the pod, shoving her inside before she could resist. She stared at him, stunned. "You fool." D grinned. "Yeah, people say that a lot." Then he slammed the activation panel. The doors sealed instantly. LX pounded on the glass, shouting something he couldn't hear as the pod began its launch sequence. DNE took a step back, watching as the countdown flickered on the interface. "Well," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, "this is a horrifically bad idea." Then the pod launched, streaking away from the warship, cutting through the darkness of space like a comet. Dane let out a breath, rolling his shoulders. "All right, nightmare ship, you and me, let's tango." He turned toward the nearest console. Containment, that was the plan. The ship was failing, breaking apart from the inside, but it wasn't gone yet. If he could isolate the infection, lock the creature in a feedback loop, destabilize its hold on the physical world, maybe, just maybe, he could stop it from spreading. Or more likely, he'd be turned into intergalactic soup. Dan grinned to himself. At least I'll go out dramatically. He cracked his knuckles and got to work. 2 days later, Dan opened his eyes. There was light, a bright, unfamiliar sky above him, the feeling of sand beneath his fingers, the distant hum of alien engines. He groaned, sitting up. A familiar figure stood over him, silver-blue skin, violet eyes, LX. "You are alive," she said, the tiniest hint of relief in her voice. Dan blinked and didn't see that plot twist coming. She arched a brow. "You stole my escape pod." DNE grinned. "Yeah, you're welcome." She exhaled, shaking her head. "Fool." Dan leaned back against the sand, staring up at the sky. "So, what happens now?" LX hesitated, then softly she said, "Now we talk." Dan smirked. "Oh good, I love talking." And for the first time, LARX almost smiled.